the artists and the work that I was talking about to feminist art that would appear in a history book. I think they're kind of two different chronologies operating at the same time. That number one, there's this sort of linear historical trajectory going from like the feminist art made during the 60s and 70s, during the women's liberation movement, that's kind of established this yeah, it's kind of established it as a specific history. And at the same time, the artists involved in that particular movement are a particular generation. And so not only is there this sort of linear historical progression, taking that work that was being created during the 60s and 70s and kind of moving it along the timeline of contemporary art history, but then there's also this dynamic between this generation of women from the 60s and 70s and generation of third wave feminists in the 90s and early 2000s, and then younger women my age. And so I think comparing sort of those two different chronologies as the linear trajectory and as sort of generational trajectory makes it hard to me, really hard to directly compare the two and to say that this feminist art is the logical progression of what women were making, starting in the 60s, 90s, whatever, and thinking of it as something that either tacks on to that history or is a new generation's approach to creating work from a feminine perspective and kind of responding to creative identity from that perspective. So I think I don't think anyone anyone studying feminist art today is a big fan of separating that history into distinct waves. And I think third wave feminism is very much about resisting definition and like embracing everything. So to me, it's not as important to link this onto a history. It's more like trying to understand whether it's a younger generation's response to creating artwork in this contemporary moment, or something that's a part of that history.
This is from Matthew. I remember when I read like Sculpture in the Expanded Field, I thought it was really like radical because it created a new definition for sculpture out of two negatives and formed this positive. And I was wondering, and then like the essay that you referenced kind of used that as a model, and it totally made sense, and I had never heard of it, so that was really interesting to me. But have you in like your research encountered any other like essays that were kind of totally new, you know what I mean? Like that just kind of relied on themselves about sound art?
Yeah, I mean there's a whole sort of publishing industry at the moment. There's a publishing house called Continuum out of the UK, and they are basically dedicating themselves to the practice. It's sort of this new emerging thing. A lot of universities are starting sound studies programs. So yeah, Seth Cohen published that in 2009. He is from Yale, and he actually coordinates a PhD program in studio art practice up in New Haven. And then a book was just published in 2010 by Salome Vogelin called Towards a Philosophy of Sound Art that goes into some of these things. And then the other author that I mentioned, Brandon Lavelle, also on Continuum, as if it's like a record label or something. But he's written a lot of books. He's a practicing sound artist, but he wrote sort of like a little mini history of sound art called Background Perspectives. But he's constantly writing things about sound and spatiality and sound and architecture. And that's sort of a different lens to look at it through. And then there's sort of a radical sect of people writing on sound and noise in particular. A lot of my other research is on noise music and on noise politics and things of that sort. And there's sort of a very active Marxist sect that writes on these sorts of things. Matin, he is from the Basque region of Spain, and he and a number of other writers published this anthology last year called Noise and Capitalism on those topics in a very broad range. They didn't sell it. You could send them an email sort of relaying your experience of noise and capitalism and get a copy. I wrote about living in Cleveland, Ohio, and anyone who knows Cleveland, and yeah, so I mean, there's a lot being written, and it's sort of an emerging sort of thing. Even in terms, even at like musicology programs, you know, they're developing sound studies. So yeah, I mean, I think that's why it's really exciting. It's developing a lot. It's changing. I think it's fun when it's sort of moving away from these visual art modalities and sort of developing its own thing. Because it's very easy to sort of reference something that you heard with something that you've seen in the past. And I think that's what Kim Cohen does with this little, you know, Krauss rubric. It's handy, but it doesn't sync up exactly. You know, I think that there are things that you hear that you don't see, in other words.
Yeah, definitely. That's what, because when I like read the description for this thing, I was like, yeah, it's really hard to like theorize the moment that you're in, you know, like to make it historical.
It's also hard to theorize things that